Hello and welcome back to my deconstruction of David Hume's book, A Treatise of Human Nature from 1739. Before we head in, I would just, do a little coursing, what's it called? Musings on Hume. I wanted to show you a book I have, which is this one, called The Essential Philosophical Work by Wordsworth. And, first of all, it's a thick tome, right? It's about 800 pages, something like that, of Hume's work, right? And it's only the essential ones. Now, I'm not religious or anything like that, for sure. But if I would point to anything that could possibly be a stand-in for a Bible of mine, this would be it, right? This would be it. This is sort of there's something about having a book, a physical book, something that sort of you can open, you're not dependent on the electronics or the internet, or, it's sort of kind of old school. I like that. But that's just, my personal taste, right? I don't have that many books. I only have sort of physical books that I really want or need because of the quality of them, or the pictures in them, or whatever it is, right? Or the importance, maybe, right? But what is interesting about this one, this Wordsworth Classics, is there is an introduction to Hume in it. And let me see if I can... If there's with an introduction by Charlotte R. Brown and William Edward Morris. I don't know who these people are, but the introduction is absolutely excellent. There is this guy who wrote the book, or I forget his name, it's a famous history of philosophy book. Durant is called, right? And it's sort of these kinds of, and there's also Bertrand Russell's History of Philosophy, Western Philosophy, something like that. I also have that one. It gets very quickly like a fiction book, maybe that's not the right word, but it very quickly gets sentimental or emotional. Or this introduction is very straight and to the point, and it can really act as a guide for how to understand each chapter. And I actually, when I started on deconstructing this book in these videos here, right, I had forgot all about this introduction because I haven't, grabbed this book for a while now, right? But I might use this as a sort of how should I put it? A reference guide and a help understanding various chapters before I head into them, so that I can sort of guide myself a bit with the language and so on. And also when I need to do a resume, I'm planning on doing for each part of this book, I'm doing a resume of the previous sort of part, right? So that both for your sake and for my own sake, and just, recapturing what I've gone through, so that I'm sort of better prepared for the next chapter and so on, right? It makes sense to me. I like this kind of structured approach to understanding shit, right? But there's just one paragraph or a couple I would like to read out loud, because they are actually pretty good hints to have. Insights, understandings, whatever. Trying to be precise here, right? To have before you head into reading the work in the first place. Okay, so it says something. They go into a description of his curriculum until he dies, and then a few other hints. Then they talk about Hume's project, method, and machinery, and this is interesting because this is sort of, when you deconstruct, what is he actually trying to do? It's sort of meta-philosophy, or the mechanics of philosophy, and the purpose of the philosophy. Because, as I always say, everybody has an agenda. Everybody has an agenda. You don't do anything without an agenda. And Hume would say that it's the passions that rules the game, right? I'm paraphrasing. The passions should forever be the I forget the quote. It'll be later in the treatise, I believe, right? There's always an agenda, right? This thing of pure reasoning that Kant was also critical of, without me being any kind of expert on Kant, right? That reasoning is sort of grabbed out of nowhere. You need to have a reason for why you are going to reason. You're not reasoning. I couldn't sit here and reason about how to find a blue, panda bear, right? I could reason about that. It sounds ridiculous right off the bat, and I wouldn't venture further down that road, possibly, right? But I could reason just about anything. But because I can reason about anything, I need to choose what the fuck to reason about, right? And therefore, in general, when you reason about things, you have an agenda. And I think that spills over to a general kind of thinking, which is philosophy, is thinking about all your thinking at the same time. Why would you want to do that without some kind of passion behind it? And what is Hume's project, method, and machinery, right? And I think that I won't go that deep into it, but there's a big one, right, which is pushing against organized crime. I almost say organized religion, right? And these extremists of a religion, which is basically subduing human nature rather than trying to figure it out and understand it and get to some kind of moral stance, right? And when it comes to morality, there's an important aspect that I hadn't been aware of before we started here. I don't remember reading it in the introduction. I've sort of, when I read it, whatever, how many years ago when I read this the first time, maybe 8 years ago, 10 years ago, or something like that, right? Maybe it's even more. I think it's actually about almost 12, 15 years, something like that. But let me read it out loud. Hume's project, method, and machinery. Before we look at Hume's contribution to these debates, we need to understand how he conceives of his philosophical project. What are its aims? What methodology should it employ? He answers these questions in his introduction to the treatise in the abstract, and he answers these questions in his introduction to the treatise in the abstract and in the first sections of both inquiries. As the title of the treatise proclaims, Hume's subject is human nature. He summarizes his project in the subtitle, an attempt to introduce the experimental method of reasoning into moral subjects. In Hume's day, moral, and this is important, moral meant anything concerned with human beings, not just morality or ethics. Moral philosophy contrasts with natural philosophy, or what we now call natural science. Hume aims to bring the scientific method to the study of human nature. Now, that's important because as water has run under the bridge since then, right? Morality have become about ethics, a particular subject in philosophy, rather than dealing with human nature. So because the term human nature is in the main title, he uses the term moral subjects, a moral subject into moral subjects in the subtitle. So human nature and moral subjects are the philosophy about human nature is morality, right? And this has been confined in later years to a particular subset of philosophy about human nature, you could say, right? So back then, things were quite simpler, right? They hadn't had 150 years of crazy academics trying to dilute any good thinking with ginormous amounts of useless shit, right? Okay, that's why it was possible back in 1739 to write a treatise on philosophy. Who in their right mind would try to do that now, right? Because you would have to, encompass all this meta this and meta that and 10 different kinds of metaphysics, and you seemingly you would have to encompass all of that. You will have to understand it. You would have to read something like 30,000 different books, right? It's impossible. So people have their pet subjects, and because philosophy has been pet subjectified, nobody's getting anywhere, right? And these pet subjects are not talking together. They have their delineations, but the delineation doesn't necessarily meet some other pet subject over here by some other academics, right? So they're sitting in each of their little confinements of ivory towers and talking to themselves and smelling their own farts, right? Show me somebody who's written a treatise in the last 100 years. Please. Give it to me, right? So, not you, but you over there, right? So I find this to be if you can find this one, good for you. It's a good book, right? Or it's a good, what's it called, compilation, right? So, but that's important. Morality doesn't only mean that we are going to discuss the is-ought gap, but morality as the understanding of all that which has nothing to do, or all that is not scientific. And maybe, just maybe, all this foundational stuff about human nature actually points to an understanding, a metaphysics for science, right? And also that I think that Hume he's not trying to describe morality using science, but he's saying, okay, if you're using science, there are some limitations to your understanding of how you get to science that also should guide you in how to get to more understanding of the human nature, or the understanding of human nature, right? You can't have some principles that work over here, but down here you can have all sorts of beliefs and miracles and whatever, right? It doesn't work that way, right? So he's saying you can't have both, right? You can't have it both ways. If there are principles at work over here when you're doing science, these principles must be everywhere, right? So it's something like that. I think is the approach of his skepticism isn't to just shoot down any shit, right? I mean, he will do it if it's necessary, and the philosophy points there. But he has been labeled as some kind of, a party pooper, right? Who comes and say, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this, you can't do that, fuck you, assholes, right? Something like that. And it's all these people who want to jump the is-ought gap, for instance, right? They are so prevalent. And, at least there's some who are aware that they have trouble with the is-ought gap. Some like Sam Harris, who are just sort of, I don't give a shit. There's something wrong with the argument here. If you see that you can do this, you could use another word, and or it's 300 years old, so I don't have to something like that, right? These kinds of people, that don't really care about philosophy. They just want to connect the dots as they see fit, right? So, and honestly, that's one of those things that Hume is a big proponent of, right? You have to establish some kind of foundation that emanates throughout your philosophy. You can't just say, okay, now I've done this, now I'm leaving all my principles behind, now I'm bringing all sorts of shit that I want to be there because I need it to be there. No. You have to keep going with these principles. He constantly goes back to, okay, is it an impression? Is it an idea? Is it a correlation between ideas? Or, whatever, right? And if it doesn't fit there, well, then I don't have access to it. It's just pure imagination, right? It's quite simple approach. And it's a rigid kind of thinking. It's a rigid kind of meta-thinking, or meta-philosophy, you could say, right? Which could be sort of a way to say, I have a particular structure of how I'm supposed to do philosophy. And if you don't do that, you are one of the reasons why philosophy has begotten such a bad rap, right? It's sort of the crazy woo-woo shit weirdo in the corner that scientists don't take necessarily. Or it's like, I mean, if you ask the average person on the street, right, what is philosophy? They will probably stare blank into the space, into your eyes, and say, "Well, it's some smart people in university or something like that, right?" They will have be fucking clueless, right? And is that the project of philosophy in general? I don't think so, right? What about Socrates? He went to the agora and started talking to people, according to Plato, right? I mean, he brings it out in real life, right? These people hiding in their tax-funded ivory towers, I have no patience with them, right? Okay, let's head into the next chapter.
A Treatise of Human Nature by David Hume. Book 1, Part 3, Section 10, of the Influence of Belief. But though education be disclaimed by philosophy as a fallacious ground of assent to any opinion, it prevails nevertheless in the world, and is the cause why all systems are apt to be rejected at first as new and unusual. This perhaps will be the fate of what I have here advanced concerning belief, and though the proofs I have produced appear to me perfectly conclusive, I expect not to make many proselytes to my opinion. Men will scarce ever be persuaded that effects of such consequence can flow from principles which are seemingly so inconsiderable, and that the far greatest part of our reasonings, with all our actions and passions, can be derived from nothing but custom and habit. To obviate this objection, I shall here anticipate a little what would more properly fall under our consideration afterwards when we come to treat of the passions and the sense of beauty. There is implanted in the human mind a perception of pain and pleasure as the chief spring and moving principle of all its actions. But pain and pleasure have two ways of making their appearance in the mind, of which the one has effects very different from the other. They may either appear in impression to the actual feeling, or only in idea, as at present when I mention them. It is evident the influence of these upon our actions is far from being equal. Impressions always actuate the soul, and that in the highest degree, but it is not every idea which has the same effect. Nature has proceeded with caution in this case, and seems to have carefully avoided the inconveniences of two extremes. Did impressions alone influence the will, we should every moment of our lives be subject to the greatest calamities, because though we foresaw their approach, we should not be provided by nature with any principle of action which might impel us to avoid them. On the other hand, did every idea influence our actions, our condition would not be much mended. For such is the unsteadiness and activity of thought, that the images of everything, especially of goods and evils, are always wandering in the mind. And were it moved by every idle conception of this kind, it would never enjoy a moment's peace and tranquility. Nature.
He's talking a bit about will here. He's sort of lifting the lid on possible free will, right? What he points to is an interesting aspect, I think, that even if you have an impression or ideas or passions, that doesn't mean you necessarily will be acting upon them. because in our sense of value creation, we are classifying actions according to their value, right? Our application, my application, I should say, of myself in that which I experience has various outcomes. And based on prior experiences, I classify my potential future experiences from their outcome, right? And the outcome is valued according to my rationality, which says this is of higher or lower value. And not only of higher or lower value, but what is the cost and benefit comparing to the amount of will and infliction I have to do upon reality, so to say, in order to get to that result, right? If there's a huge benefit, there's usually also a huge cost, right? And if there's a low benefit, there's usually a low cost. But it might be that there's a very high cost, but a slightly lower benefit. So even if there's the benefit to it, I might not do it because the cost is too high. The juice isn't worth the squeeze, as they say. The juice isn't worth the squeeze. I'm a little... the cost-benefit analysis is something that has to do with your, maybe not your will, but your control of your will, right? As Schopenhauer famously said, you can will, but you can't will what you will. I'm not agreeing with that. But you can, if you want to will something, you can stop yourself from willing it. You cannot maybe decide that this particular will is going to be willed into willing. Sorry about that. Because it has to do with some connections with passions and so on, right? And prior whatever experiences, then you're going to will that because, right? Hunger, then you're willing yourself into eating, right? It's not like you don't decide to be hungry, so to say, or you don't decide to will yourself to do something because of your hunger, but you are maybe not just eating whatever is in front of you, right? If you got that urge, so to say, so you are directing your will in certain you're sort of confining your will to that which is beneficial to you, right?
Has, therefore, chosen a medium, and has neither bestowed on every idea of good and evil the power of actuating the will, nor yet has entirely excluded them from this influence. Though an idle fiction has no efficacy, yet we find by experience that the ideas of those objects which we believe either are or will be existent produce in a lesser degree the same effect with those impressions which are immediately present to the senses and perception. The effect, then, of belief is to raise up a simple idea to an equality with our impressions, and bestow on it a like influence on the passions. This effect it can only have by making an idea approach an impression in force and vivacity. For as the different degrees of force make all the original difference betwixt an impression and an idea, they must of consequence be the source of all the differences in the effects of these perceptions, and their removal, in whole or in part, the cause of every new resemblance they acquire. Wherever we can make an idea approach the impressions in force and vivacity, it will likewise imitate them in its influence on the mind, and vice versa, where it imitates them in that influence, as in the present case, this must proceed from its approaching them in force and vivacity. Belief, therefore, since it causes an idea to imitate the effects of the impressions, must make it resemble them in these qualities, and is nothing but a more vivid and intense conception of any idea. This, then, may both serve as an additional argument for the present system, and may give us a notion after what manner our reasonings from causation are able to operate on the will and passions. As belief is almost absolutely requisite to the exciting our passions, so the passions in their turn are very favorable to belief. And not only such facts as convey agreeable emotions, but very often such as give pain do upon that account become more readily the objects of faith and opinion. A coward whose fears are easily awakened readily assents to every account of danger he meets with, as a person of a sorrowful and melancholy disposition is very credulous of everything that nourishes his prevailing passion. When any affecting object is presented, it gives the alarm and excites immediately a degree of its proper passion, especially in persons who are naturally inclined to that passion. This emotion passes by an easy transition to the imagination, and diffusing itself over our idea of the affecting object, makes us form that idea with greater force and vivacity, and consequently assent to it according to the precedent system. Admiration and surprise have the same effect as the other passions, and accordingly we may observe that among the vulgar, quacks and projectors meet with a more easy faith upon account of their magnificent pretensions than if they kept themselves within the bounds of moderation. The first astonishment which naturally attends their miraculous relations, spreads itself over the whole soul, and so vivifies and enlivens the idea that it resembles the inferences we draw from experience. This is a mystery with which we may be already a little acquainted, and which we shall have farther occasion to be let into in the progress of this treatise. After this account of the influence of belief on the passions, we shall find less difficulty in explaining its effects on the imagination, however extraordinary they may appear. It is certain we cannot take pleasure in any discourse where our judgment gives no assent to those images which are presented to our fancy. The conversation of those who have acquired a habit of lying, though in affairs of no moment, never gives any satisfaction, and that because those ideas they present to us, not being attended with belief, make no impression upon the mind. Poets themselves, though liars by profession, always endeavor to give an air of truth to their fictions, and where that is totally neglected, their performances, however ingenious, will never be able to afford much pleasure. In short, we may observe that even when ideas have no manner of influence on the will and passions, truth and reality are still requisite in order to make them entertaining to the imagination. But if we compare together all the phenomena that occur on this head, we shall find that truth, however necessary it may seem in all works of genius, has no other effect than to procure an easy reception for the ideas and to make the mind acquiesce in them with satisfaction, or at least without reluctance. But as this is an effect which may easily be supposed to flow from that solidity and force which, according to my system, attend those ideas that are established by reasonings from causation, it follows that all the influence of belief upon the fancy may be explained from that system. Accordingly, we may observe that wherever that influence arises from any other principles beside truth or reality, they supply its place and give an equal entertainment to the imagination. Poets have formed what they call a poetical system of things, which, though it be believed neither by themselves nor readers, is commonly esteemed a sufficient foundation for any fiction. We have been so much accustomed to the names of Mars, Jupiter, Venus, that in the same manner as education infixes any opinion, the constant repetition of these ideas makes them enter into the mind with facility and prevail upon the fancy without influencing the judgment. In like manner, tragedians always borrow their fable, or at least the names of their principal actors, from some known passage in history, and that not in order to deceive the spectators, for they will frankly confess that truth is not in any circumstance inviolably observed, but in order to procure a more easy reception into the imagination for those extraordinary events which they represent.
Let me just add a comment to this one, prior one here. We have been so much accustomed to the names of Mars, Jupiter, Venus, that in the same manner as education infixes any opinion, the constant repetition of these ideas makes them enter into the mind with facility and prevail upon the fancy without influencing the judgment. This is another way of saying indoctrination. He is mentioning indoctrination here, right? Schools are basically filling out the blanks of a memory that you can possibly create before you had any impressions yourself. And it's also somebody who wants to fill out the holes in your memory from the point of your birth until now and give you an understanding of what is going on that suits their bill, right? That's why all these isms and, religions, politics, all these that are basing their livelihood on their ability to control people's minds. They want to make sure that they can grab the children and enforce their shit on them, so that before they have got some other ones doing it, because then they are free of cognitive dissonance, the tendency to reject new information that contradicts whatever it is that is already there. But that which was already there, how did that get there? Well, it was just implanted into you. You didn't have the impressions, right? You were told so, right? A very important little part here, right? Now, the purpose of Hume, as the introductory chapter here pointed out, is possibly he's very concerned about religion, and for good reasons, in my opinion, right? And using it also as an example of how people are being mistreated rather than learning to think for themselves, right? It's sort of between the lines, I would say, right? And he's very obviously somebody who makes a virtue out of thinking for himself. And he's thinking so much for himself that he's basing his philosophy on himself, right? It cannot get more honest than that. If your philosophy is based on you, you are doing it right, because you're the one having your experiences, right? Nobody else has your experience, and you have no one else's experience. And if you do, please let me know how, right? So what could you possibly base your philosophy on other than your own experience, right? Then he extends it to sort of human nature, which is sort of a built-in axiom, in my opinion, which he may allude to, but he doesn't state outright, right? Okay, but apart from that, it's the first time in philosophy that anybody is doing it this way. And in my opinion, it's not only the right way, it is the only way. And the conclusions that fall from that is everybody has to do their own philosophy, right? And people have probably say, oh my God, 8 billion different philosophies. How can we agree upon anything? No, we need somebody. We need a politician, a crazy psychopath, threatening us with guns so we can all do the same thing, right?
But this is a precaution which is not required of comic poets, whose personages and incidents, being of a more familiar kind, enter easily into the conception and are received without any such formality, even though at first sight they be known to be fictitious and the pure offspring of the fancy.
There are a lot of typos, errors here, and I don't know what some weird kind of term. First sight, first night. How can you possibly make that typo, right? S and N isn't even close to each other on the keyboard. So it's a sort of left-hand work, this kind of typing here in this. But it's one of those weak. Either I have paid a couple of bucks for 21 of David Hume's works from Amazon, or I got it for free. Sometimes there are a sort of fire sale, or what it's called in Amazon, where there are all sorts of classical or antique books for free. You can download it for zero money, right? That's the zero is the only amount where everything is the same. 0 elephants, $0, 0 human beings, 0. You can use the same unit to say there's nothing of it, right? Never mind. How far did I get? I lost my train of thought here. Okay, I just jump back in.
This mixture of truth and falsehood in the fables of tragic poets not only serves our present purpose by shewing that the imagination can be satisfied without any absolute belief or assurance, but may in another view be regarded as a very strong confirmation of this system.
It's quite long-winded, this argumentation here, and it seems he is very, very concerned about belief, and it's hard to argue against belief, because if an individual wants to believe whatever X, right? Who am I to stop the individual from believing that? But if they tell me they believe in unicorns, I'm like, okay, knock yourself out. I'm going over here. Bye-bye, right? See you in another life. See you in unicorn land, right? When we get there. Just kidding. So beliefs are... When those who have power over you inflict their beliefs, people tend to adapt those beliefs, because it is infused with power and control and family and all sorts of other kinds of structures. So these beliefs and superstitions, these beliefs are being raised to superstitions, are being raised to stories you have to adhere to, and it becomes overpowering, and people lose themselves in these beliefs, right? Then it becomes religions and dogma, and you have to be killed and ostracized if you don't and then it completely overpowers people, right? So that's why it's dangerous that you have something that is a belief 50 or 100 years down the road, people are killing each other because of it, right? And it was just sort of I wanted to believe in unicorns. And 50 years later, people are fucking having religious wars, right? And I think that it's this concern that Hume understands that its beliefs can be fucking dangerous. Not in the first instant and the second or third or fourth iteration, but down the line it compounds into complete destruction, right? You see that in Rise and Fall of Empires, right? The 7 stages of empires. You start out small and then it grows a bit. Then there's a free market. Then all the psychopaths take over and start to control the free market and siphon off money from it and start wars and destroy the value creation and inflate the money, and people are running away, and then they're taken over by some other empire and fades away, right? It's the same story. There's somebody, I don't remember the name, but there was one guy who wrote the 7 Stages of Empire, or a title like that, where he takes basically all the empires that have been in the world, from Assyrians to the United States, right? That they go through these 7 stages. It just keeps repeating over and over and over again, right? Within some, like, I don't know what, but 200 years or some 250 years it takes usually, right? And from start to finish, and then it falls apart, right? And it's basically because of enforced beliefs, right? Beliefs that then become something you have to adhere to, that then becomes a mantra, that then becomes a religion, and infuses itself in all of the culture and civilization, and children are forced to have education because you have to learn to do this because people have beliefs and it's important to adhere to beliefs. And most notably, women are very concerned about whatever beliefs is out there because they have to adhere to those beliefs, otherwise they might be left out of the matriarchy or whatever, right? So it always ends up being small beliefs in the beginning that ends up destroying empires, right? Now maybe I'm a bit out on my rails here, right? But that's how I see it. If you see the big history, the big lines in history, right? I like history in the sense that it says something about the mass behavior, or the human beings need to conform. Conformity is basically the same as saying some shit is going to go down at some point, right? Order followers are the useful idiots who are the glue that keeps together bullshit that will eventually end up destroying civilizations, right? There is a podcast series and a video channel I can recommend, which is called actually The Fall of Civilizations. As far as I remember, I think it's called The Fall of Civilizations, right? It's not necessarily empires, right? The recent one is chapter 17 or 18, something like that, and which is about Carthage, which was also, they went through all these weird stages, that the 7 stages of empire, right? There was a new empire, new kid on the block, the Roman Empire, which basically annihilated Carthage, right? And they sort of are famous, the Punic Wars and all that. But I think he is basically, Hume has the Enlightenment positivity that thinking is that which is going to lead us to peace and prosperity, right? If we don't think rigidly, we are ending up in all sorts of belief shit that ultimately is going to kill millions and billions of individuals for no fucking good reason, right? So I think that the passion in him for clarity and rigidity and pure philosophy as far as it can take him is basically the passion in him, right? That's my contention, right? I can't tell you, right? But I have a sort of between the lines, right? And I am, I am of the same ilk as David Hume myself, right? I have this strong positive urge that, and I'm framing it as positive. I mean, I don't mean to inflict any belief on you, right? But there has to be some optimism in the philosophy, right? There has to be some optimism. Otherwise, it's not worth the effort, or it's not something that you want to improve something. It's because if you're not optimistic, if you're pessimistic, you're basically drowning yourself in your own shit and becoming a slave to pessimism in order to justify you not having to be optimistic, right? So sort of this Schopenhauerian pessimism that a very strong focus on all the costs of life rather than seeing the benefits, right? And if you think that I'm putting all this cost into it and later I will have these benefits, and then when you get the benefits, it didn't really move your life any further, and then you say, well, it's not worth living, basically, right? It's all pain and suffering, and what I got out of it, I didn't get it over on the other side of positivism, or so today. The cost benefit analysis doesn't seem to check out, right? But then the philosophy you had behind what you did back then wasn't good enough. Then that's the problem. It's the philosophy behind it, rather than saying the result of my bad philosophy wasn't good enough. So therefore, I should be a pessimist about it, right? That's not good thinking, in my opinion. You should say, no, I have to have some better philosophy. And from then on, I might have a better cost-benefit analysis or cost-benefit result, right? Okay.
It is evident that poets make use of this artifice of borrowing the names of their persons and the chief events of their poems from history in order to procure a more easy reception for the whole, and cause it to make a deeper impression on the fancy and affections. The several incidents of the piece acquire a kind of relation by being united into one poem or representation. And if any of these incidents be an object of belief, it bestows a force and vivacity on the others which are related to it. The vividness of the first conception diffuses itself along the relations and is conveyed as by so many pipes or canals to every idea that has any communication with the primary one. This, indeed, can never amount to a perfect assurance, and that because the union among the ideas is, in a manner, accidental. But still, it approaches so near in its influence as may convince us that they are derived from the same origin. Belief must please the imagination by means of the force and vivacity which attends it, since every idea which has force and vivacity is found to be agreeable to that faculty. To confirm this, we may observe that the assistance is mutual betwixt the judgment and fancy, as well as betwixt the judgment and passion, and that belief not only gives vigor to the imagination, but that a vigorous and strong imagination is of all talents the most proper to procure belief and authority. It is difficult for us to withhold our assent from what is painted out to us in all the colors of eloquence, and the vivacity produced by the fancy is in many cases greater than that which arises from custom and experience. We are hurried away by the lively imagination of our author or companion, and even he himself is often a victim to his own fire and genius. Nor will it be amiss to remark that as a lively imagination very often degenerates into madness or folly, and bears it a great resemblance in its operations, so they influence the judgment after the same manner, and produce belief from the very same principles. When the imagination, from any extraordinary ferment of the blood and spirits, acquires such a vivacity as disorders all its powers and faculties, there is no means of distinguishing betwixt truth and falsehood. But every loose fiction or idea, having the same influence as the impressions of the memory or the conclusions of the judgment, is received on the same footing, and operates with equal force on the passions. A present impression and a customary transition are now no longer necessary to enliven our ideas. Every chimera of the brain is as vivid and intense as any of those inferences which we formerly dignified with the name of conclusions concerning matters of fact, and sometimes as the present impressions of the senses. We may observe the same effect of poetry in a lesser degree. And this is common both to poetry and madness, that the vivacity they bestow on the ideas is not derived from the particular situations or connections of the objects of these ideas, but from the present temper and disposition of the person. But how great soever the pitch may be to which this vivacity rises, it is evident that in poetry it never has the same feeling with that which arises in the mind when we reason, though even upon the lowest species of probability. The mind can easily distinguish betwixt the one and the other, and whatever emotion the poetical enthusiasm may give to the spirits, it is still the mere phantom of belief or persuasion. The case is the same with the idea as with the passion it occasions. There is no passion of the human mind but what may arise from poetry, though at the same time the feelings of the passions are very different when excited by poetical fictions from what they are when they are from belief and reality. A passion which is disagreeable in real life may afford the highest entertainment in a tragedy or epic poem. In the latter case, it lies not with that weight upon us, it feels less firm and solid, and has no other than the agreeable effect of exciting the spirits and arousing the attention. The difference in the passions is a clear proof of a like difference in those ideas from which the passions are derived. Where the vivacity arises from a customary conjunction with a present impression, though the imagination may not, in appearance, be so much moved, yet there is always something more forcible and real in its actions than in the fervors of poetry and eloquence. The force of our mental actions in this case, no more than in any other, is not to be measured by the apparent agitation of the mind. A poetical description may have a more sensible effect on the fancy than an historical narration. It may collect more of those circumstances that form a complete image or picture. It may seem to set the object before us in more lively colors. But still, the ideas it presents are different to the feeling from those which arise from the memory and the judgment. There is something weak and imperfect amidst all that seeming vehemence of thought and sentiment which attends the fictions of poetry. We shall afterwards have occasion to remark both the resemblance and differences betwixt a poetical enthusiasm and a serious conviction. In the meantime, I cannot forbear observing that the great difference in their feeling proceeds in some measure from reflection and general rules. We observe that the vigor of conception, which fictions receive from poetry and eloquence, is a circumstance merely accidental, of which every idea is equally susceptible, and that such fictions are connected with nothing that is real.
No, but a way to approach this might be if somebody is reading a story out loud, and let's say there are 5 people listening to this story, and it's impossible not, if you are engulfed in the story, to sort of imagining the scenery. At least that's it worked, and maybe I'm a bit of a more visual kind of being than most people. I like visuals, right? I very much enjoy visuals. I like movies. Also like sound, right? I like music, but I do like visuals. I like art. I like design. I like um, the visual aspect of things are important. Though at times when it's the audio, I'm less concerned about visuals. I mean, people buying stereos because of how they look. They buy Bang& Olufsen B&O rather than buying that which sounds best for the money, right? Because it looks nice, so it must sound nice, right? Um, but let's say that we have 5 people listening to this story. They all conjure up an imagination about the story because you can't help doing that, in my opinion, right? To a greater or lesser vivacity and force, right, as Hume would call it. But if you would be able to somehow present these ideas or presentations of each of those 5 mind on 5 different screens, you would see 5 different, in some way equal, but the qualia and the composition would be different. They wouldn't be the same. That's my contention, right? That would be my axiom. Why would they? I mean, I am conjuring up a picture based on some sounds I'm hearing. Why would those pictures be the same as the next guy? Because my memory of memory and cognitive abilities and so on that I've been through in my life until then are more or less different than the next guy or girl, right? So what I'm using to create this imagination is almost surely bound to be different, at least to some extent, than the next guy or the next guy or the next guy. And that idea is sort of indicating that if we are experiencing the same thing, if we are dealing with objectivity, if I say that's an elephant, I am directing my experience somewhere. But if I'm only receiving a story, that story is particular to me. That imagination, or whatever you want to call it, is particular to me. If I say that's an elephant, I'm directing my focus from my experience outwards, you could say, in an attempt to objectify, in the hope that I can, using language to communicate to another person and agree upon that object and create objectivity, right? You wouldn't do that from a story. You wouldn't start to point and say, hey, there's an elephant in my, Hannibal story, right? Oh, look, there's an elephant in my Hannibal story. You would start pointing there, right? You wouldn't try to reach objectivity because you are enveloped in your story because of the passion of the story. That's why you can go to the movies and sit there for 1.5 hours and look at funny pictures and get a satisfaction out of following that story. It's part of human passion that we like stories, huh? So that maybe that's a way to deal with this, right? So this one is going to be slightly more than an hour, I think.
This
So that's just too
observation
bad.
makes us only lend ourselves, so to speak, to the fiction, but causes the idea to feel very different from the eternal established persuasions founded on memory and custom. They are somewhat of the same kind, but the one is much inferior to the other, both in its causes and effects. A like reflection on general rules keeps us from augmenting our belief upon every increase of the force and vivacity of our ideas. Where an opinion admits of no doubt or opposite probability, we attribute to it a full conviction, though the want of resemblance or contiguity may render its force inferior to that of other opinions. It is thus the understanding corrects the appearances of the senses and makes us imagine that an object at 20-foot distance seems even to the eye as large as one of the same dimensions at 10. We may observe the same effect of poetry in a lesser degree, only with this difference, that the least reflection dissipates the illusions of poetry and places the objects in their proper light. It is, however, certain that in the warmth of a poetical enthusiasm, a poet has a counterfeit belief and even a kind of vision of his objects. And if there be any shadow of argument to support this belief, nothing contributes more to his full conviction than a blaze of poetical figures and images, which have their effect upon the poet himself, as well as upon his readers. End of file 25.
Okay, so this was the end of section 10. And I'll just leave it there. Thank you for coming along this far. Please share, like, and subscribe. Consider a donation to me. Links below or on the board. There's also possibility of paying using crypto. If you are a crypto millionaire, I wouldn't mind a donation, right? Otherwise, see you in the next one.